A fist pounded on a door in the middle of the night. 3 times, hard enough to rattle the glass. Then again, louder, desperate, the way a person knocks when something has gone very wrong. A man came down the dark hallway in bare feet, his heart going fast, not knowing who he'd find out there so late. He flipped the porch light on. He turned the lock. He pulled the door open into a wall of cold rain. And there on his porch, soaked to the skin, a suitcase at her feet, stood the last person he ever expected to see again. It was Margaret, his ex-girlfriend's mother, crying, shaking, drenched through. And what she asked him, standing in that downpour, made him grip the doorframe. "Can I stay with you tonight? I have nowhere else to go." Why was she really there? Stay with me on this one. Let me back up. Because to understand why that knock on the door changed everything, you have to understand the man who answered it. His name was Daniel. He was 31 years old, and he lived alone in a small house at the edge of town, the kind of house with a porch and a yard and too many quiet rooms for one person. He worked with his hands. He built things, fixed things, ran a small contracting business that kept the lights on and not much more. He was the sort of man people called when something was broken and they needed someone dependable. Steady. That was the word for Daniel. Steady. A year before that night, Daniel had been engaged, or close to it. He'd been with a woman named Vanessa for 3 years, and he had loved her the way you love someone when you're sure they're the one, completely, and without holding anything back. He'd built a life around her. He'd built that porch for her, actually, with his own 2 hands, because she said she wanted a place to drink coffee in the mornings. And then Vanessa left. No warning, not really. One day she was there, and then she was telling him she'd met someone else, someone with more money and more excitement, someone who didn't come home with sawdust in his hair. She said Daniel was a good man, but that good wasn't enough. She said he was boring. She packed her things while he stood in the kitchen not knowing what to say, and she drove off, and that was that. 3 years, gone. Let me tell you one small thing about Daniel, so you understand the kind of man we're talking about. The morning after Vanessa left, when most men would have been in bed with the curtains drawn, Daniel got up at 5 like always. Not because he was fine. He wasn't fine. But because the elderly widow 2 doors down had a leaking roof, and he'd promised to fix it that week, and a promise was a promise even when your whole world had just walked out the door. So Daniel climbed up on that old woman's roof in the cold and fixed it, and he wouldn't take a dime for it. And when she asked how his fiancée was doing, he just said, "We're not together anymore," and kept working. That was Daniel. He'd break quietly, on his own time, and never once let it stop him from doing right by somebody else. Now here's the thing you have to understand about that whole relationship. It wasn't just Vanessa who made Daniel feel like he wasn't enough. It was her whole family. And the sharpest one of all, the one whose approval Daniel had wanted most and gotten least, was Vanessa's mother. Margaret. Margaret was a proud woman. Elegant, sharp-tongued, the kind of woman who could make you feel 2 inches tall with a single raised eyebrow. In 3 years, she had never once warmed to Daniel. She thought her daughter had settled. She thought a man who worked with his hands and drove a truck full of tools was beneath the family. She corrected his grammar at dinner. She asked pointed questions about his income. She made it clear, in 100 small ways, that she was waiting for Vanessa to come to her senses and find someone better. So when Vanessa finally left, a part of Daniel figured Margaret had gotten exactly what she wanted. He figured the whole family had thrown a little party about it. And in the years since, he had not spoken to a single one of them. Why would he? That chapter was closed. He'd spent that year slowly putting himself back together, learning to sit on that porch alone, learning that quiet wasn't the same as empty. He'd made a fragile kind of peace. And now here was Margaret, on his porch, in the rain, at midnight, crying. Daniel stood there gripping the doorframe, and a dozen thoughts went through his head at once. Was Vanessa hurt? Was somebody dead? Had they come to blame him for something? Because in Daniel's experience, when that family showed up, it was never good news for him. "Margaret," he said, "what are you? What's happened? Is Vanessa okay?" And Margaret, this proud, sharp woman he had never once seen with a hair out of place, stood there dripping on his welcome mat and completely fell apart. She put her hands over her face and she sobbed, the kind of crying that comes from somewhere deep, the kind of person can't fake and can't stop. Vanessa's fine, she managed. This isn't about Vanessa. Please, Daniel. I know I have no right. I know what I am to you. But I didn't know where else to go. You're the only good person I could think of. Please just let me in out of the rain. Now, if you've ever had someone who looked down on you show up at your lowest and theirs, if you've ever had to decide, in 1 second, whether to be the bigger person to someone who never gave you that same grace, then you already know the choice Daniel faced in that doorway. And if you're still with me, take 1 second and hit that subscribe button, because what Margaret told him once she was inside is the reason I wanted to tell you this whole story. Daniel stepped back and opened the door wider, because that was who Daniel was. He could not leave a crying woman standing in the cold rain, not even this woman, not even the one who'd spent 3 years making him feel small. It didn't even take him a second to decide. Whatever she'd done to him, she was a human being in trouble on his porch in the middle of the night, and Daniel had never in his life been able to turn his back on that. It simply wasn't in him. He brought her in. He got her a towel and a dry blanket and one of his old flannel shirts to change into, and he put the kettle on. He didn't ask her a single question while she got warm. He just moved around the kitchen quietly, the way a decent person does when someone is falling apart in front of them, giving her room to breathe. He found the space heater and set it by her chair. He made the tea strong and put honey in it without asking. And little by little, sitting at his kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a hot mug, Margaret stopped shaking. And she started to talk. And what she told him, over the next hour, turned everything Daniel thought he knew completely upside down. It started with the house. Margaret's house. The big, beautiful house she was so proud of. The one where she'd made Daniel feel so unwelcome at all those dinners. It was gone, or as good as gone. Margaret's husband, Vanessa's father, had died 2 years back, and Margaret had discovered, in the awful months after, that the man had left behind a mountain of debt she'd known nothing about. Bad investments, a second mortgage, loans against everything. The elegant life had been built on a house of cards, and when he died, it all came down. Margaret had spent 2 years quietly selling things to stay afloat. The jewelry, the car, then the furniture. She'd kept up appearances as long as she could, because appearances were all she'd ever had. But that very afternoon, the bank had finally taken the house. She'd packed 1 suitcase, and she'd found herself, at 63 years old, with nowhere to sleep. She told Daniel how it had happened, and the details were worse than he'd imagined. She described standing in the empty house that afternoon, in rooms stripped down to the carpet, waiting for the man from the bank to come and change the locks. She described how not one of her fancy friends, the ones she'd hosted at all those dinners, the ones she'd impressed for 40 years, had offered her so much as a couch. The moment the money was gone, they'd scattered. 40 years of careful friendships, and when the truth came out, there wasn't a single person in that whole social circle willing to be seen helping her. That was the world Margaret had built. A world that only loved you as long as you had something to show. What about Vanessa? Daniel asked. Why aren't you with her? And that was when Margaret told him the second thing. The thing that really landed. She'd gone to Vanessa first. Of course she had. Her own daughter. She'd shown up at the apartment Vanessa shared with her new man, the exciting one with the money, and she'd asked her only child if she could stay for a little while, just until she got on her feet. And Vanessa had said no. Her new boyfriend didn't want a house guest, she said. It would be awkward, she said. She gave her own mother the name of a motel and $200 and sent her back out into the rain. And here's the part that Margaret could barely get out. She said Vanessa hadn't even looked ashamed. She'd handed over the $200 the way you'd tip a valet, quick and impatient, wanting the whole uncomfortable thing to be over. Her own mother, standing there having just lost everything, and Vanessa had checked her phone twice during the conversation. Margaret said the worst part wasn't even being turned away. The worst part was recognizing, in her daughter's cold politeness, a perfect mirror of herself. Every dismissive thing Vanessa did, Margaret had done first, for years, to other people. To Daniel. Margaret sat at Daniel's table and said the words that had been breaking her heart all night. I raised that girl to think that money and comfort were the most important things in the world. I taught her that. And then the first time I needed her, she looked at me the way I taught her to look at people who couldn't do anything for her. She looked up at Daniel with red eyes. She looked at me the way I used to look at you. The kitchen was very quiet. Rain ran down the windows. I drove around for 2 hours, Margaret said. I didn't have anywhere to go. And isn't it a terrible thing, Daniel? The only person in this whole town I could think of who might not slam the door in my face was the one person I was cruelest to. You. The man I told my daughter wasn't good enough. You're the one I came to. Because in 3 years, the worst thing you ever did was be kind to me when I didn't deserve it. And I have been sitting in my car tonight thinking about what a blind, stupid, prideful old woman I have been. And here is where the story turns. Because Daniel could have said a lot of things right then. He could have told her she was getting exactly what she'd dished out. He could have reminded her of every cutting remark, every cold dinner, every time she'd made him feel like dirt on her shoe. A lesser man, a bitter man, would have enjoyed that moment. But that is not what Daniel did. Daniel got up. He refilled her tea. And he said, "You can stay in the spare room as long as you need to. It's not much, but it's warm, and it's dry, and nobody's going to send you back out into the rain. Not while I'm here." Margaret looked at him like he'd struck her. And then she started crying all over again, but a different kind of crying this time. She kept saying she couldn't, that it wasn't right, that she had no claim on his kindness after everything. And Daniel just shook his head and said the thing that told you everything about him. "Margaret," he said, "I don't help people because they've earned it. I help them because they need it. That's the whole point. If we only ever helped the people who deserved it, nobody would ever get helped at all." And Margaret, who had spent her entire life keeping a careful ledger of who deserved what, sat in that kitchen and understood, at 63 years old, that she had been doing the math wrong her whole life. Now, let me tell you what happened over the days and weeks that followed, because this is the part one really want you to hear. Margaret moved into the spare room, and at first it was awkward, the way you'd expect. Two people who'd only ever known each other across a wall of judgment, suddenly sharing a kitchen. But something happened when you take away the money and the status and the appearances, when you strip two people down to just who they actually are. You find out what's really there. Those first few days, neither of them quite knew how to act. Margaret would try to stay in her room so as not to intrude, and Daniel would knock gently and tell her dinner was ready and that she was welcome at the table, always. She insisted on doing something to earn her keep, so she started cooking, and it turned out that under all that store-bought elegance was a woman who could actually cook, really cook, the way she had before she'd had money and a caterer. Daniel would come home wrecked from a job site, and there'd be a hot meal waiting, the first hot meal anyone had made for him in over a year, and the two of them would sit and eat and slowly, carefully, learn how to talk to each other like human beings instead of enemies. Margaret, it turned out, was not the woman she'd pretended to be for 60 years. Under all that pride was somebody who'd been scared her whole life. Scared of being poor, because she'd grown up poor and never told anyone. Scared of being seen as less. She'd married a man for security and spent 40 years terrified it would all disappear, and then it had, and the terror was over, and what was left was just a tired old woman who'd finally stopped pretending. And Daniel, well, Margaret watched Daniel for a few weeks, really watched him, the way she'd never bothered to before. She watched him get up before dawn and work all day, and come home tired, and still fix her a plate. She watched him help the elderly neighbor carry groceries without being asked. She watched him refuse to say a single unkind word about Vanessa, even after everything. And Margaret realized, with a kind of grief, that she had spent 3 years in the same room as the finest man she'd ever met and had been too foolish to see it. There was one evening that changed things between them for good. Margaret had been with Daniel about a month, and she'd been trying so hard to be no trouble, to stay small and quiet and out of the way, because deep down she was terrified that he'd wake up one morning and decide she was a burden and put her out, the way her own daughter had. And one night Daniel came in and found her at the kitchen table, quietly crying over a shoebox of old photographs, the only thing she'd grabbed from the house besides clothes. Pictures of Vanessa as a baby. Pictures of a family that didn't exist anymore. And Daniel didn't say anything clever. He just sat down next to her, and he looked at the photos with her, one by one, and he let her tell him the stories behind them. For 2 hours. A tired man who'd been up since 5, sitting with an old woman's grief because she needed somebody to. That was the night Margaret stopped being afraid he'd throw her out. Because she finally understood that Daniel wasn't the kind of man who threw people away. He was the kind who picked them up. "I owe you an apology," she told him one night. "A real one. I spent 3 years treating you like you weren't worthy of my daughter. And the truth is, she wasn't worthy of you. I'm sorry, Daniel. I'm so deeply sorry." And Daniel, who had waited 3 years to hear someone in that family say those words, found that they meant more coming from Margaret than they ever could have from anyone. Now here is where I have to be honest with you about the strange and beautiful thing that grew in that little house at the edge of town. Because it was not what anyone would have predicted. Daniel and Margaret became, of all things, family. Real family. The kind Daniel had never had, because his own parents were long gone, and the kind Margaret had thrown away. Not romance. Something rarer than that, and in its own way stronger. Two people who owed each other nothing, who by every rule of the world should have been enemies, choosing each other anyway. A son who got the mother he never had, and a mother who got a second chance to be one, and to get it right this time. She started helping him. She had a good head for numbers, it turned out, when she wasn't using it to look down on people. She started keeping the books for his contracting business, and within a few months she'd found where he was losing money and turned a struggling little operation into something that actually made a profit. Daniel, in turn, gave Margaret something she hadn't had in years. Purpose. A reason to get up. A person who was glad she was there. And you should have seen the change in her. The woman who'd shown up on that porch soaked and broken, convinced her life was over at 63, came alive again. She'd sit at Daniel's kitchen table with a calculator and a stack of invoices and a cup of coffee, and she'd hum to herself. She started answering the business phone, and she was so good with the customers, so warm and sharp at the same time, that Daniel started booking more jobs than he could handle. She'd negotiate with the suppliers and save him a fortune. For the first time in her whole life, Margaret was valued for something real, something she actually did, instead of the size of her house or the name on her handbag. And it turned out that was what she'd been starving for the entire time. Not money. To be useful. To be needed. To matter to somebody. The town talked, of course. People always talk. An old woman living with her daughter's ex-boyfriend. What a scandal. But it wasn't like that, and the people who mattered could see it wasn't like that. It was two lonely people who'd been discarded by the same family, building something new out of the wreckage. Margaret became the mother Daniel had lost. Daniel became the child who actually showed up, the one who was there, the one who cared. And then, about 6 months in, Vanessa came back. Word had reached her, the way word does, that her mother was living with Daniel and that Daniel's business was doing well now. That there was money again. That the house at the edge of town was warm and full and happy. And suddenly Vanessa remembered that she had a mother and that she'd had a good man once. And she showed up at that porch on a sunny afternoon with a smile and a story about how she'd made a terrible mistake. She wanted them both back. She missed her mother, she said. She missed Daniel, she said. She'd realized what really mattered. And here's the thing. She'd brought all the old charm with her. The smile Daniel had once fallen for. The little laugh. She talked fast and warm about how the new man hadn't worked out, about how she'd been confused, about how she saw everything so clearly now. She reached for Daniel's hand on that porch. She called her mother Mom, in a soft voice she hadn't used in years. She was good at it. She'd been good at it her whole life. Getting people to give her what she wanted was the one thing Vanessa had always known how to do. But something was different now. Because the two people standing on that porch had spent 6 months learning the difference between what glitters and what's real. And the spell just didn't work anymore. Daniel and Margaret stood together on that porch, the porch Daniel had built with his own hands, and they looked at Vanessa, and they saw the same thing. They saw someone who had turned her own mother away in the rain, and turned a good man away for a flashier one, and had come back now only because the wind had changed. It was Margaret who spoke first, and what she said, Daniel never forgot. "You had a mother who needed you," Margaret said quietly, "and you gave her a motel and $200. You had a man who loved you more than you will ever be loved again, and you called him boring and drove away. I spent your whole childhood teaching you to chase the shiny thing and step over the good thing. That's on me. But you're a grown woman now, Vanessa, and I have finally learned the lesson I should have taught you. So let me teach it to you now, standing here. She took Daniel's arm. The good thing was always the one that mattered, and you don't get it back just because you noticed too late. This man opened his door to the woman who'd been cruelest to him. That's who he is. That's what I threw at your feet for 3 years and called not good enough. I was a fool. Don't spend your whole life being one too. Vanessa looked at the two of them. She looked at her mother standing arm in arm with the man she'd thrown away, the two of them steady and settled and home in a way she had never once been. And she understood that there was nothing for her here anymore. Not because they hated her, but because they had both, finally, learned to value the right things, and she was still learning to value the wrong ones. She tried one more time. She turned to Daniel, and she dropped her voice, and she said, "Daniel, come on. You love me. You built this whole life for me. You can't just replace 3 years with my mother." And Daniel looked at her for a long moment, and when he answered, there was no anger in his voice, just the plain quiet truth. "I did love you," he said, "with everything I had, and you told me good wasn't enough. Well, your mother showed up at my door with nothing, and she found out that good was the only thing she had left that was worth anything. She learned. You never did. That's the whole difference between the two of you." He put his arm around Margaret. "This isn't me replacing you, Vanessa. This is me finally being loved back by somebody in your family. It just wasn't ever going to be you." She left, and this time, nobody watched her go with a broken heart. The years that followed were good ones. Quiet ones. The best kind. Daniel's business grew, and Margaret ran the office, and the two of them made a strange little family that worked better than either of their real families ever had. She was there for every holiday. She was the one he called with good news. When Daniel eventually met a kind woman named Sarah, a nurse who thought a man with sawdust in his hair was exactly right, it was Margaret who knew before he did, Margaret who pushed him to ask her out, Margaret who cried at the wedding in the front row where the mother of the groom is supposed to sit. And Sarah, being a wise woman, understood right away what Margaret was to Daniel and never once tried to change it. She folded Margaret into their little family without a second thought. She said any woman who'd helped make Daniel into the man he was had a place at their table for life. The two women became close, closer than Margaret had ever been with her own daughter, and Margaret used to say, quietly, that she'd done nothing in her life to deserve landing so soft at the end of it, and that she thanked God every day for the rain that had driven her to the right door. And when Daniel and Sarah had their first child, a little girl, they named her middle name after Margaret. And that little girl grew up with a grandmother who spoiled her rotten and told her, over and over, the most important thing she knew. Choose the good ones, Margaret would tell her. The steady ones. The ones who show up in the rain. I learned that lesson late, sweetheart. Don't you make my mistake. And the little girl, too young to understand any of it, would just hug her grandmother's neck, and Margaret would hold on tight. This woman who'd once had everything and lost it, and then found something better than everything, and she'd close her eyes and thank the storm all over again. Margaret lived to be 84. She died in that house at the edge of town, in the warm spare room that had become her home, surrounded by the family she'd found instead of the one she'd been born to. Daniel held her hand at the end. He was the one who buried her. He gave the eulogy, and he called her his mother, because that's what she'd become, and there wasn't a dry eye in the place. In that eulogy, Daniel told the whole story. He told a room full of people about the night a proud woman had knocked on his door in the rain with nowhere to go, and how letting her in had turned out to be the best decision he ever made. He said people talk about second chances like there's something you go out and grab. But sometimes, he said, a second chance shows up soaked to the bone on your porch at midnight, disguised as the very last person you'd ever want to see. And all you have to do is be kind enough to open the door. He said Margaret had taught him that a family isn't about blood, it's about who shows up and who stays. And then he said that Margaret had shown up broken and stayed 20 years and been the finest mother a man could ask for, and that he would spend the rest of his life grateful for a rainstorm. Vanessa did not come to the funeral. Nobody had really expected her to. She drifted further away over the years, from one shiny thing to the next, and somewhere along the line she'd stopped calling altogether. But that's a sad story for another day, and this one is about the people who got it right in the end. The night she'd knocked on his door, soaked and broken and out of options, Margaret had believed she was at the end of everything, that she'd ruined her life and her family and had nothing left. She was wrong. She'd knocked on the one door in the world that would open for her, and behind it was not the end of her story, but the beginning of the best part of it. Sometimes the family you need isn't the one you're born into or the one you marry into. Sometimes it's the good man you were too proud to see, standing in a doorway at midnight, choosing to be kind to you anyway.